It is a pleasure to be here today. I'm Michael Rasmussen, as was mentioned, and so my job is research. I research what are the challenges companies like yours face in the world of governance, risk, and compliance, including RegTech, and how do you go about solving those challenges with strategy, process, and technology. And we've got a great panel here with a lot of insights on this important topic of regulatory change management. Gosh, how do you guys stay awake at night? I mean, financial services firms is what I call navigating chaos. All the volumes of regulatory change on top of a changing and volatile risk environment, on top of a very changing dynamic business environment that you have to keep in sync. So we're gonna unpack this now in this panel of navigating regulatory change management in 2024, challenges, agility, and innovation. I'll invite the panelists to come up. And so we have Hillary, the Enterprise Chief Compliance Officer and Head of Regulatory Relations at Valley National Bank, Anand, the Head of Regulatory Change Management at SMBC Corporation, Kevin Medina, the Global Chief Compliance Officer at Värde Partners, and Kayvon, who we heard just a few minutes ago in the closing keynote, the previous keynote, the VP of Product Management, Archer. Why don't we take just a couple minutes and just each of you, like the 30 to 1 minute, introduction of yourself. Should we start?
Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Medina. I am currently the Global Chief Compliance Officer at Värde Partners, which is a global credit asset management company. I've been a compliance professional since shortly graduating after law school since 1998. I'm not sure if that makes me the old guy on stage, but I've been doing this quite a long time. Started out in bank compliance, but mostly focused on investment advisor and private fund space.
Good morning, Hillary Rosenberg, Chief Enterprise Compliance Officer and Head of Regulatory Relations at Valley National Bank. Valley is a $62 billion in assets bank with approximately 3,000 employees. I've been there for approximately 2 months, and it's been really amazing, and I'm happy to have my colleagues here with me today. Prior to being at Valley, I was at Bank of New York. I was there for 2 years as the Chief Compliance Officer for their custody and fund services business, as well as their digital asset business. Prior to that, I was at a bank called Standard Chartered. It's a UK-based bank with operations mostly in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And I was the global head of anti-corruption and the head of financial crime compliance learning. Started my compliance career at JP Morgan, but started my legal career as a prosecutor in the Manhattan DA's office, where at the end of my time there, I was focused on securities fraud, money laundering, and sanctions violations, which is how I came into the compliance space. Great to be here.
Hello, everybody. Anand Narayanan, and I head the regulatory change management function for the Americas division at Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. In my role, I basically manage both the operations as well as the RegTech tool side of the function. And we are exploring a lot of new capabilities and enhancing the GRC piece within SMBC, and I have a critical role in that as well. And prior to that, like a lot of my colleagues here, spent a lot of time with banks in financial services, and prior to that, spent half my career in consulting as well. So I've seen it from both sides, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Nice meeting you. Kayvon Alakani. I'm leading AI strategy and assurance strategy at Archer. Joined forces in February after merging with Archer, a company I co-founded, Compliance AI. Became part of that. Prior to that, I was leading strategy at RSA for about 5 years, identity access governance lifecycle, and before that in identity management. With governance, risk, and compliance, it's great to have Michael. I think you pretty much coined the term, so look forward to your insights as well. Yeah.
Well, I'm excited for this panel, and our very first question is, what is the magnitude of regulatory change impacting the financial services firms in 2024? The magnitude. I've seen stats like the Thomson Reuters stat from a couple years ago that global financial services firms are dealing with 257 regulatory change events every business day coming from 1,217 regulators around the world. That's a lot. But you not only have the horizon scanning, what's happening 6 months, 1 year, 2 years out, what's happening here and now, the enforcement actions, but then you have to keep all this current in the business too and that impact. So Kevin, why don't we start with yourself? What is the magnitude of regulatory change impacting financial services?
I think you just said it there. If you work for a global firm, like I work for a global firm, it is, I've worked for just firms focused in the US, and I'm worried about the SEC or I'm worried about FINRA. I go to this firm now, and I've been at other firms like this, but they give me this fancy title, Global Chief Compliance Officer, and I grab the title. But then I get to there and I see the reality of I have to worry about Singapore, I have to worry about India, I have to worry about the UK, I have to worry about Luxembourg, I have to worry about everywhere because we have clients and investors in all of these jurisdictions, and every regulator wants, wouldn't say a piece of us, but every regulator wants to protect their investors and their citizens. So staying on top of that is just a daily event. And you said, I don't know how you sleep at night, or I don't know how you go to sleep at night. I don't sleep at night because my business is open 18 hours a day. I have folks who are in London, I have folks who are in Singapore, who are sort of first line of defense there, but it rolls up to me and I ask them on a daily basis to keep me informed as best they can, but keeping track with all of those regulatory changes is what I spend a good 20-30% of my time on. It's not just 2024. If you've been doing this a long time, you have seen the pace of change just multiply. It's just faster and faster than ever. We were speaking early in my career, a lot of what we were doing in the regulatory changes were driven by what scandal of the day was happening. Was it AML scandals because the president of Mexico's brother was using Citibank to launder money? Well, that's what I spent my first year or so doing, all about AML. So as the scandals occur, Enron, WorldCom, Madoff, those kind of scandals happen, the compliance teams have had to move in that direction. And then you have systemic risk issues, global financial crisis, those open up all kinds of more challenges for a compliance team. And the regulators are not slowing down. Even if the Fifth Circuit tells the SEC you must slow down, I don't think they're going to slow down, and we have to try to stay ahead of that. And trying to figure out how any of these companies can help us is why I'm here today, and I imagine why you're here today.
So much of what I see in regulatory change management is like driving a car, but you're driving the car only looking at the dashboard or the rearview mirror, not at the road in front of you, because there's so much going on right in the cockpit of the car and things that you can't even keep up with what's happening on the horizon and where the car is even headed.
Absolutely right. So that's why you have to have a good team behind you. You can't do this alone. And what I tell my team is you guys have to do the blocking and tackling every day. I'm trying to figure out what's going to happen next year, 3-5 years from now. But having that right team around you, and that's not just compliance professionals, that's partnering with everybody in your organization who are also going to keep on top of changes in the business in their areas so that they can inform you in your regulatory activities.
And I would just add to that and kind of having the reverse journey that you had. So I was starting kind of at the big international banks, and now I'm at a regional bank, and kind of expecting initially to think that the reg change, I mean, certainly the quantity of reg change is different going from international to US, but the US is so focused on regulatory change, and particularly at a regional bank, which, as we know, last year in Q1, there was a lot of focus, right? And the focus on regional banks and the systemic impact that they have. And now we are starting to feel the downstream impact of that event and the real focus and spotlight that regional banks have and what that means. What that means from a compliance perspective, from a risk management perspective, and how we need to factor that into our business model. Things that we thought we would be able to do, maybe we have to pivot and do it a little bit differently. And in a similar vein, the focus on regional banks is similar to when I was at Bank in New York, and the Chief Compliance Officer for digital assets, which is a whole other realm of regulatory change that is still coming into being and still evolving. And so I just think regardless of the type of financial services you're in, there's a massive amount of regulatory change that's quite reactive and is really shaping the environment.
Absolutely, I would definitely agree with that, right? So earlier, the regulatory focus was primarily on large financial institutions, right? So since last year, there is additional scrutiny on mid-sized banks as well, and I think you could extend that to non-banking financial services as well, because the lines between banks, traditional banks, financial services firms, and fintech firms are blurring. And regulators are getting more and more worried about the impact of those organizations on the systemic risk associated with the economy as such, right? So if you look at it, the reason for the magnitude of increase is also because right now regulators are focusing more and more on supervisory aspects within organization. They want the senior management and the board to be more responsible for all things happening within the bank. And there is also an emphasis on timely remediation of some of the identifications in terms of risks, like findings. And because of that, it's generating a lot more enforcement actions and actions by regulators as well, right? So there is more emphasis on effective risk management, and that is also driving the magnitude of regulatory change.
I just wanted to add that to your point about enforcement actions, the volume is so high, and for small companies that don't necessarily have the resources of a global FI, what we found over the past 7 years, and this was interesting, getting feedback from CCOs, CROs, was that for mid-sized banks, they were actually focusing on enforcement actions and reading consent orders to actually understand the true intent of the regulator, that are not slowing down and are also very opaque. There's not a lot of transparency on the actual interpretation of what needs to happen. So enforcement actions became, for compliance AI, like the #1 report that was used throughout the organizations that were using the product.
So our next question, agility. Agility is the ability to think and act quickly, to respond, to know what's coming, to prepare. Agile. We hear so much of this word agile. So, Anand, we'll start with you. How agile are financial institutions in managing regulatory change effectively? What are the specific operational challenges being faced?
So when it comes to agility, large banks or large financial institutions are still, finding it hard to move at the pace at which the regulations are coming out, right? So that definitely is a challenge, right? So smaller, mid-sized banks and organizations are able to adapt quickly, and that's because of some of the challenges that exist. Like we did speak about that in the beginning, right? So the volume of change, right? So I read somewhere that there is roughly about 300 million pages of regulatory expectations that's out there in the internet, and roughly about 500,000 changes are coming out on an annual basis, right? So that's a lot to handle, and especially with banks having global footprint, it becomes even more difficult for them to handle. So having the right kind of capability and operations to manage the volume of change, and more importantly, analyze and interpret and contextualize the change itself, is definitely a challenge that a lot of the organizations are facing. And especially with some of the regulations coming out that has multi-jurisdictional impact, right? It becomes even more difficult to do that. The other thing that still continues to be a problem with some of the organizations is the silos, right? So there are various business organizations within the bank, there are various functions, and all of them have their own way of managing regulatory change. It is siloed, and we might be implementing technology that is localized, but connecting this technology and deriving synergies and efficiencies still seems to be a challenge. And that's why I'm really excited with all the GRC help that banks are getting and helps that financial services organizations are getting. The other thing that I do want to talk about is cost and resources are definitely challenge in making regulatory change more agile within organizations. Like so, however we want to present this, regulatory change management is definitely a stepchild within the organization that doesn't get the resources and attention that it typically needs. Organizations have slowly started realizing that it could be a competitive advantage rather than it being a reactive thing, right? And because of that, we do get funding and resource, and we are able to do more and become more agile. Finding talent is also a challenge when it comes to regulatory change, right? Especially regulatory change is something that you need to be a master of or jack of multiple trades. You need to be analytical, you need to be able to interpret, you need to be able to manage the implementation effectively. So that there are multiple skills that are necessary, and finding the right talent is a challenge. And finally, the one thing that I do want to mention that regulators are focusing more and more, that is definitely a challenge when it comes to agility, is the sustainability of regulatory change within organizations, right? So while a lot of organizations are good at implementing regulatory change, sustaining that over long periods of time is still a challenge that many of the organizations are facing, right? So essentially, I mean, these are some of the things. I am talking about things that are at the macro level, but then you could have things that are specific to organizations.
I'm anxious to hear from our other panelists. I mean, some of the stats I've heard, I've already mentioned the one Thomson Reuters one, but I've never tested this. But I'm told that if you print off the United Kingdom's FCA rulebook, it's a stack of paper 6 feet tall. I don't want to put my printer through that. If you print out the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations and stack it end to end, it's longer than a marathon. That's a lot of paper. That's a lot to keep up on. And that's not even the enforcement actions and everything else we've discussed. That's just the raw regulation. You know, any thoughts from the rest of our panel on how do we address agility here?
So what I think about when I think about regulatory change is two paths, a formal path and an informal path. And the formal path is you have a system that identifies regulatory change based on parameters that you've set. Maybe you're using AI to help identify particular risks or regulators or products, business areas that you're focused on, and those kind of go through a system and someone reviews it, and this is a documented process. That's kind of the formal process that I think about that will be looking at those reams of paper, right, and using technology to do that. Then kind of the informal part of reg change, I think of as part of a compliance monitoring and advisory function. I think compliance plays a really important role to have that ad hoc monitoring, to be subscribed to the regulators that you're subject to and their press releases, the enforcement actions, the NPRs that are coming down the pike, and to be able to quickly read them, interpret them, and provide a service to your business by saying, here, this is coming down the pike. We need to think about how this is going to impact the business model. How is this potentially going to impact the economics of what you want to do? Where financial services in particular, and with regional banks as I'm seeing, there is a market share that banks are desperate to get a piece of, and they need to innovate and grow to maintain relevancy. Having that compliance officer providing that service to you on the impact of reg change, and to be able to be agile, right, and be reactive to it in a proactive way, I think is a really important part of a compliance function, in addition to the formal reg change management processes that you must put in place, because regulators are going to ask you about it, you're going to get audited about it, and a big question they're going to say is, how do you know your reg change management process is working? And so having the tools is going to be extremely important.
Someone said earlier this morning about when they come into the office and they tell their people to stay away from your email and go out and talk to people. That is so very important. I'm not so good at it, but I'm trying to be better at it. And it's not just talking to people in your own firm, but it's calling people you meet at conferences, calling people from LinkedIn, quite frankly. Everybody loves to talk about what they know and talk about themselves, but if you really use LinkedIn and get to know people there who are in similar situations, everybody's happy to hear from a colleague who does the same thing. Say, what are you guys doing here? What are you hearing here? Best practices still do matter, and hearing what other people are doing and stepping away from the rule book, stepping away from the computer is just so important. And may I continue to do so, and this is part of that, I think.
Yeah, one thing that we heard repeatedly, I think over 200 times, aside from the word Microsoft Excel is what we do everything in, was also keep asking, like, what is the number one challenge that you have? And to Anand's point, repeatedly the answer was we can't hire people fast enough. And so it painted a picture for me of like throwing bodies at it. These are not cheap bodies, these are super expensive bodies, typically with legal tech background. And so I feel like part of that agility is demanding more of the vendors and really demanding more from them through, I would say, quantifiable return on investment. I was spending this much time managing regulatory change before your solution, now I'm spending this much. I was allocating 50 people to reviewing stuff, now there's only 20. I was spending this much, you know what I mean, very quantifiable results with a before and after that they should be able to paint through automation and AI.
Yeah, if I may just add on to that, right? So you were talking about throwing bodies at a problem, right? So, and especially with regulatory change management, one of the biggest problems that you have is when the state is in session, right, you typically are hit with volumes that are unprecedented, right? But when the state is not in session, the volume dies down, right? So the biggest challenge with some of the organizations that have an in-house regulatory change management function is how do you scale up and scale down to handle volumes, right? So, and I've been talking about this for 2 years. I mean, if there are vendors, there is an opportunity out there. A scalable support model that's able to augment big organizations' responsibilities during uptimes and downtimes is definitely a gap that I've not seen being filled in the industry, right? So getting that kind of a support, outside of the organization as a third-party support is definitely going to be useful.
Wow, technology. We've already talked about it throughout all these questions, but now let's just dive deep into technology. I've had a lot of interaction with my friend and fellow RegTech collaborator Ian Hollowbred at ING Bank. He ran ING Labs for several years, and he's now the Chief Operating Officer of Digital Innovation at ING, and I'll be meeting with him again in London in just 2 weeks. But he put a lot of these technologies through their paces in ING Labs, and I compared notes on my research with them, and we both came up with some of the same things, that some of the solutions out there are sort of what we would characterize as the Wizard of Oz, where it's the man behind the curtain and not as much of the AI and the technology that's being promoted. Others provide a lot of value and depth there. Also, there's a lot of solutions. Like one solution might be very strong at that horizon scanning. Another solution might be really strong at this here and now redlining and regulatory change. And somebody else might be strong in the policies or the controls. And a lot of these RegTech solutions were originally built, like if you look at a pie, for a piece of the pie instead of the whole pie. But now we're starting to see this little pie come together and all these pieces through the mergers and acquisitions of different components and parts. There's still strengths and weaknesses in all these products. But let's dive into this. What technologies hold the most potential for transforming regulatory change management? Keyvan, will you lead us on this one?
Sure. I'm going to actually key off of what Anand just mentioned. I think you've heard about the word AI and generative AI repeatedly. One thing that is becoming critical is really the ability to, first of all, let's talk about companies that are similarly chartered. Truly, if you're, bank where Hillary is currently leading compliance practices, I would probably imagine there's 400 to 500 other institutions that are very similarly chartered to your organization. So why are you guys doing the same thing over and over again in silos, right? why, to your point, why can't a tech provider say, you know, as far as your profile, as far as your business's profile, I can tell you exactly what's applicable to you. In 2017, when we launched Compliance AI, we ended up creating these high brand, well, we didn't create them. We branded high quality headphones and put our logo on it, and we said, we are noise cancellation headphones for regulation, basically, to reduce the noise, that mountain of information. How do you reduce it to just what's relevant to the company? But we very quickly found something that I want to mention also is that the tech cannot be black box machine only. So another big part of what we're seeing over, by the way, if you've read the EU AI regulation, really mandating what I'm about to say. Machine generated, expert verified. Machine generated, by design, human in the loop. I mean, it's mandatory. It's not something that's optional. It's required for the outputs that are provided by such systems. So I would say a tech innovation, yes to AI, yes to the use of modeling, yes to use of user data to create very, very robust statistic results, obviously to reducing that noise through profiling, but also machine-generated, expert verified. You want to look for that stamp of approval. You want to look for the explainability, to the auditability, and I think to the correctability of that information. It was wrong, and we had a mechanism of fixing that. So looking for those characteristics in the technologies become critical. And I would also say a big part, of course, with the availability of a good number of language models, and we've gravitated at Archer towards the use of an abstraction layer so that we can switch between LLMs and sometimes use RNN and sometimes use predictive ML. So best of breed, as opposed to becoming religiously or emotionally attached to a specific large language model provider, and demanding those characteristics, explainability, auditability, correctability, and transparency, and of course requiring that this information wasn't just thrown at you, was actually verified, or there's checks and balances in place to correct it if issues are identified. I think those would be some of the key aspects. We've found that the use of company, let me go back, Archer, with its deep heritage on control and risk management, the use of good amount of data that it's suggested, recommended, provided in the form of controls and control procedures, an example, has led to a highly innovative approach to providing control procedures to companies, something that 10 years ago was completely unimaginable. And then what we ended up doing was started looking at the accuracy of the results and getting phenomenal results out of that. But again, it requires that secondary expert oversight to ensure the quality of the assertions are of utmost quality.
So for me, I would be cautiously optimistic about AI, right? So one of the reasons is, well, you know, in the last 2 years, we have seen a lot of potential in AI, right? But it's also important that the adoption of AI in the most commonly used use cases is more important for organizations to generate the kind of, you know, productivity gains and capabilities, right? So not, well, I mean, let me take it back, right? So there is one big bank that I've seen which has a published AI agenda and manifest that they are, you know, actively working towards, right? So in a lot of other organizations, it still is in the lab, right? People are looking at prototypes and ways to implement it, but well-adopted industrialization of AI within banks, especially in the regulatory change management space, is still picking up steam, right? So that is my opinion, right? But having said that, with the capabilities that are available within AI to interpret regulatory change and connect that to various risk management components within the banks, is going to be really important for banks to understand what an impact of a regulation is on them and the ability to respond more quickly. Going back to your question on being agile, right? That kind of technology is going to help. The other thing is, like you said, Kevan, right? So analyzing large volumes of data and interpreting that, or building something that is unique to that particular bank and how it is going to impact the bank is also going to be very important. So, well, excited about AI, but would like to see more adoption in terms of industrializing it within the organization.
Yeah, I echo that. I'm also optimistic about AI, but I'm not sure, at least in what I've looked at so far, is I've told my senior managers I don't think it's ready for prime time. We did look at an AI solution that promised to record, transcribe, and identify potential instances of MNPI transfer during expert network calls. It was very cool, very interesting. Our goal was to try to reduce our workload because I have my team supervising, chaperoning public company calls. So anytime we deal with an expert that works at a publicly traded company or has worked at a publicly traded company, we feel the risk of MNPI transfer there is a little greater. So we've been chaperoning those calls. So we'd like to reduce that number. We did about 75 calls last year. Maybe we can reduce that. We look at this platform, this AI solution, and honestly, the amount of red flags that it was identifying, we felt that we were going to be chasing down those flags it was going to take even longer than the hour we were attending those calls. And what we've done with the SEC in the past, and I've done this at other jobs, they ask you have expert network policies, you say yes, you chaperone, you monitor, and largely the SEC have walked away and they say, oh, that's great, you chaperone, you have a procedure in place, and that's it. So this solution, I always say I'm looking for to be compliance plus. What else can I do to make that regulator happy? And I kind of saw this as, that could have been that, but I think it would have just caused more work than what it promised to do. Never mind what I say, that company just got bought out by another company. So there is promise there, and obviously people are excited about that. So just because I wasn't ready, I don't think it's ready, it doesn't mean it's not going to be ready in a few years' time.
Well, we have a next question here. And Kavan already mentioned this already, but he talked about ROI a little bit. What's it cost you now? What's it going to cost you in the future? What's the delta between that? When I work on business cases, and I worked on one global European bank's business case for reg change and policy management, they had a policy that because of a regulatory change, that took 6 months to get updated. It went through 75 reviewers in a document check-in and check-out fashion. That's certainly not agile and highly inefficient, all because of one reg change. And you calculate the volume of reg change and the number of policies that have to be updated or controls. That's a lot. But efficiency is just one angle of looking at a business case. Another one is effectiveness. I was talking to the chief ethics and compliance officer at a large pharmaceutical firm and found that technology for reg change in the life sciences industry, they found to be 30% more accurate than humans. If you have a stack of paper 6 feet tall, your mind's going to wander. But so efficiency, effectiveness, but also resilience. How can we find regulatory issues and gaps in our policies and controls with the regulations and address those? But also that agility, that horizon scanning to know what's coming at us. So Hillary, we'll start with you. What are some of the requirements that you see that firms need to consider when implementing technology and workflows into regulatory change management activities?
So I think about the answer to that question in really 3 broad buckets. It takes people, it takes process, and it takes technology. And from a people perspective, it really takes everyone at the bank to be involved and to be dedicated to identifying and mitigating and implementing processes, controls to react to reg change management. And it really does start with the board. And you have to get the board's buy-in. And from there, you can take that message and bring it down into the rest of the organization. But you also need the board's buy-in, not just because they are responsible for understanding the regulations impacting the bank, but because you're going to need that investment. And as we're talking here today, it's not cheap. And it's not going to be a small line item. This is something the whole bank needs to get on board with. I remember when, I won't say which bank, but I was at a bank. And they're like, what do you mean all these regulations? We have to comply with them. I don't understand. And, I don't live in the US, so why do I need to comply with US regulations? And there's just so many of them. And the harsh reality is that if you're working at a bank, if you're working in financial services, it's highly regulated, full stop. If you don't want to deal with that, you're in the wrong industry. And so it really takes buy-in, and it's going to take a tone from the top to be able to get that buy-in. So that's really the people part. The processes, this goes to that formal reg change management I was talking about. You need to have a policy. You need to have procedures. You need to have desktop operating procedures. You need to have them reviewed on a periodic basis. You need to have them monitored. They need to go through your entire compliance process, and you need to be able to answer the question that you're inevitably going to get from the regulators is, how do your processes ensure you're not missing anything that you need to have? And the processes also have to ensure that everything that you're doing is documented and has an audit trail. And that's really where I think the technology is extremely important. You have to have, in my opinion, and this is not Valley's opinion, this is my opinion, a technology solution to support that workflow, not just the input of the reg change, but how you are responding to it. In places I've worked, compliance, for example, would be the first port of call for reg change. They would assess, is this applicable to our geographies, to our business model, to our products, to our customers? And if so, what is the potential impact? Where does this belong in the bank? And send that reg change to the impacted party in the first line. And we talk about 3 lines of defense. This is where the first line really demonstrates that they're owning, right, the reg change. Again, this is why people are so important. And that's where they really look into it and determine, okay, this is going to impact how we do this or how we do that. And then compliance is there to provide that oversight and challenge. And then you have other parts of the organization that are going to have to come together to implement whatever change needs to be done within the period of time before like an emerging new law, rule, or regulation goes into final status and is effective. And so really it takes everyone. It's not just a compliance issue. It's not just a risk issue. And having that technology tool, making sure that it's updated, making sure that you have you are talking to your colleagues on the street, and what are they doing? How are they doing this? Because the regulators are going to be comparing you to what your peers are doing. And so being at conferences like this, having your ear to the ground, and making sure you're up on the technology to support all of this is really important.
If I may add, right, so, and I completely agree with all things Hillary just mentioned, right? So, what I've seen is there are organizations that get the technology enabling right, and then there are organizations that have a real challenging time even after they have implemented the technology, especially in sustaining the process, right? So reg change management is unique in the sense that it's got like a significant amount of interpretive activities associated with it, and it also has evaluation activities associated with it. So it's important, especially when you're trying to technology enable and make the organization agile, you are able to clearly understand what the interpretive components are and what the evaluation components are. When it comes to the interpretive components, it's very important for you to productivity enable the interpretive components. Like for instance, if you want to evaluate the impact of a regulatory change on an organization, you will have to provide the person who is doing that evaluation with some kind of a rubric, right? So you cannot replace professional judgment and analysis, but you can enable, productivity enable that. So that's how you productivity enable the interpretive component. But there are other aspects of the workflow, like Hillary mentioned, where you can automate it, right? So evaluation, right? Report generation, so on and so forth, right? So I think any regulatory change management implementation is a combination of these 2 aspects. And it's very important for organizations to spend the time upfront, understand this, and plan it so that they're not just efficient, but effective in their regulatory change management implementations.
Just wanted to say to Kevin, to the case you mentioned, and Hillary and Anand, I feel your pain. So this is tech to the rescue. I think the tech has matured over the past 6 or 7 years. The pace of improvement and automation, and also the maturity of these solutions, changes from conference to conference. Like if we're talking about this 2 months ago, we would be discussing it in a different light than we are today. The pace is very high, and I also am very pleasantly surprised at the number of forward-leaning CCOs, CROs that are adopting new tech, and I think as that number gets higher, the level of confidence that you'll have in the solutions will rise. But obviously today we have some showcases around this area as well. Yeah.
Now, my final question, if we have time for audience questions, I'll get to that. But if you can put them in the Umbrella app. But we have one more question before we get to audience questions. But if you have questions we don't even get to today, feel free to LinkedIn message me or something. And my job is research, so I'll find out the answers and get them to you. That's what I do. And I'll work with the panelists in getting those answers if we can't get to your questions. We talked a lot about agility and horizon scanning and seeing what's coming at us. So our final question, how far away is the industry from implementing concrete predictive capabilities in regulatory change management? Predictive, that horizon scanning to go through what's developing out there, what should we be concerned about, not just today, but tomorrow. And Kavan, will you lead us on this?
No, absolutely. I think that you'll be very pleasantly surprised to find that I go back to that profiling, understanding the business. Where do you operate? Where are your jurisdictions? What is your area of focus? What is your team's thematic area of focus? You may have at each organization different focus areas. From there, we're finding that tech today is able to do a really good job providing that initial reduction of noise from mountain of information to only what's relevant to that team. And then from there, if the organization wants to, continue to listen in on the organization's feedback, not relevant. This does not apply to us, and use that to continuously improve the results for the organization. I think that from that perspective, this could be at the tail end of it, really start with lead to a much more rapid adoption of the technology.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that, and I'm actually not surprised to hear that, just because what I've seen in my career, we used to call it, and you probably do as well, call it the 80-20 rule. 80% of the time in all the jurisdictions that I've operated in, the rules are similar, right? It's investor protection, it's disclosure, so those are always similar. So that 80%, I imagine, is very, or somewhat more easily predictable, and you could look into the future and see what regulatory bodies are doing, because they are all talking to each other. They are absolutely all talking to each other. The SEC is talking to SEBI, SEBI's talking to MAS in Singapore. I've seen it, and they talk about it frequently in the press. The 20, much more difficult. But I think it's you can get there because it's only 20 and it's a lot smaller, right? But that 20% of the super local regulatory concerns, and therefore the regulations, will be a little more difficult to predict.
Last 43 seconds.
So as far as I'm concerned, I kind of agree with what Kevin said, right? So we are at a point where technology is getting better and it's going to enhance the predictive capabilities, right? And I'm very interested in the listening in part of it, right? Because it helps organizations prepare better for upcoming regulatory changes. But I think a big dependency for that is for organizations to have good data, good interconnected ecosystem that is able to build lineage from the point of regulatory expectation all the way through policy, standards, and all the way to controls which demonstrate adherence, right? So once you have an interconnected ecosystem, listening in becomes more valuable because the effect of that change can be evaluated across the various risk and compliance management components within the organization, and that kind of an intelligence is going to be even more useful in the future.
Or a little over. This has been an insightful panel. What a great set of panelists with their insights. Can we give them a round of applause?